My name is Logan Hayes. I'm 36 and I serve as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. My profession demands precision, a world where every action is deliberate and measured. But that disciplined exterior is just one part of me. If you were to ask what truly defines my soul, the answer isn't found on any military base. It's in a sprawling home nestled on a hillside in the suburbs of North Carolina. A property valued at nearly $70 million, a staggering sum to most. But the monetary figure is meaningless to me. That estate is where I came into being, the very ground where I learned the weight of love, the necessity of responsibility, and the unshakable foundation of integrity. It was never just a collection of rooms, it was the universe my parents, Richard and Eleanor Hayes, built. Every principle I hold dear was forged within those walls. You see, this account isn't really my own. It belongs to my family, to a legacy, and to the powerful lessons that molded the man I have become. The home rests on a gracefully sloping hill, surrounded by immense pine trees that stand watch like ancient guardians over the grounds. I can still picture the way the early sun would pierce through their needles, dappling the vast lawn with shifting patterns of gold. It always felt as though the world outside was creating a masterpiece just for our family. Its walls of cool, pale gray stone and its tall, expansive windows make it more than just a feat of design. To me, it stands as a testament to the enduring love and unwavering commitment my parents poured into creating our life there. Each corner and every single room holds a distinct memory, a story from those sun-drenched days that are seared into my mind. I took my first breath in that house, grew up secure in my parents' embrace, and the sound of my younger brother Caleb's laughter still seems to echo in the hallways. My father, Richard Hayes, carried himself with an imposing height, his hair a distinguished mix of silver and black, but it was his eyes that held you, sharp, intelligent, and piercingly direct. By trade, he was a titan of industry, the man who built a celebrated investment firm in North Carolina from the ground up. Yet my profound respect for him had nothing to do with his fortune or public acclaim. It was rooted in the principles he embodied every single day. He used to say to me, his voice low and serious, "Logan, the true measure of a man has nothing to do with the size of his bank account. It's about who he is when he believes no one is looking." That single piece of wisdom became engraved on my soul, a moral compass that has guided every significant choice I've ever faced. He was a man of strict standards, absolutely. But his love was a constant, powerful undercurrent in our lives. I can still vividly recall those weekend mornings. He'd be at the head of the massive dining table, absorbed in the morning paper through his silver-rimmed glasses, while Caleb and I tore through the house, our imaginations transforming us into knights clashing with invisible beasts. He would eventually lower the paper, a faint knowing smile touching his lips, and his voice would cut through our ruckus. "My boys, over here. Tell your old man what the world taught you today." We'd immediately stop our game and settle at the table, breathlessly recounting tales from school, squabbles with neighborhood friends, or the scrapes we earned from climbing the old oak tree too high. He gave us his complete, undivided attention, never once cutting us off, and would always distill our childish adventures into a simple, profound lesson. "Listen to me, Logan, Caleb," he'd conclude, his gaze steady. "A man owns his choices, good or bad. You always do the right thing, especially when it's the hardest thing to do." My mother, Eleanor, was the undeniable heart of our home. She possessed a smile that could calm any storm, eyes that held a soft lunar glow, and a voice so full of warmth it could soothe any hurt. Where my father taught me the rigid architecture of integrity and duty, my mother was the one who filled that structure with the boundless grace of love and self-sacrifice. My mother's intelligence was quiet but profound. She'd been a literature professor before choosing to devote every ounce of her energy to our family. I can still see her so clearly on those long evenings, settled in her favorite armchair by the crackling fireplace, drawing Caleb and me close to share fairy tales or recite poetry from memory. Her voice, a gentle current carrying the words of Whitman or Frost, would wash over the room, making the world feel safe and right. "Logan, my sweet boy," she would murmur, her hand enclosing mine with a firm, reassuring grip. "Don't ever believe that strength is about being hard. A truly strong man understands how to love, and he knows how to forgive." She had this incredible gift for turning the ordinary into something magical. For every one of our birthdays, she would spend hours baking an enormous cream cake. The decorations were always the main event. Delicate, intricate flowers she would craft from sugar, each one a tiny work of art. The memory is a sensory overload, the warm, sweet scent of baking wafting from the kitchen, the sound of her soft humming as she worked, and the feeling of her arms wrapping around us in a hug that seemed to say that nothing else on earth was more important. "You boys," she'd whisper into our hair, "you are my most precious treasures." And hearing it from her, I knew with absolute certainty that it was true. Caleb, my brother, is a full 9 years younger than me, and we couldn't have been more different. Where I found my joy in tearing around outside, climbing trees until my knees were scraped, or kicking a ball with the other kids in the neighborhood, Caleb was content to sit by himself with a sketchbook. He would lose himself for hours, meticulously drawing the dense woods behind our house or capturing the impossible grace of a bird in mid-flight. He was a sensitive soul, with a vulnerability that was plain to see, yet beneath it was a core of resilience that I have always deeply admired. Caleb was never one to start a conflict, but he would never ever back down from one if it concerned his principles. I'll never forget the time, he must have been only 7, when a much bigger kid from down the street started mocking him for his love of drawing. I was watching from the porch, ready to step in, but I held back. Caleb just stood his ground, his small hand gripping his drawing pencil so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked the other boy right in the eye and said, his voice trembling but firm, "I don't have to fight you to prove that what I love is good." A wave of pride washed over me. At the time, of course, I just laughed it off and messed up his hair, but I never forgot it. We were raised in an embrace of unconditional love, but it was coupled with unwavering discipline. My parents were adamant that we never become entitled or arrogant because of our wealthy circumstances. "You boys are fortunate to live in this beautiful house," my father would state, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But you will not let it define who you are. Money can purchase a building, but it takes love and character to build a home." That mansion, with its endless hallways, the priceless antique paintings lining the walls, and the magnificent flower garden my mother cultivated with her own hands, was so much more than a place to live. It was a physical manifestation of our family's heritage, a symbol of the core values our parents were determined to instill in us. One of my most cherished memories is of our family dinners in the great dining hall. The long oak table would be draped in a white silk cloth and covered with an incredible spread my mother had spent all afternoon preparing. Perfectly cooked roast beef, creamy mashed potatoes, and loaves of warm, fresh bread. My father would lift his wine glass, his eyes shining with a deep, quiet pride, and he would talk about family tradition. "This," he would declare, his rich, warm voice resonating through the high-ceilinged room, "is our legacy. Not this house, not the money in the bank. It is love, integrity, and responsibility. It is your duty to protect that legacy no matter what comes your way." Caleb and I would nod seriously, though in those years the true gravity of his words hadn't fully sunk in. All I knew for sure was that in that moment, sitting around that table, surrounded by my mother's melodic laughter, my father's steadying voice, and the bright sparkle in Caleb's eyes, I was completely and utterly safe. I was home. It felt like an unbreakable bond, as if no force on earth could ever tear our family apart. As the years passed and I moved into my teens, the weight of my future responsibilities began to settle on my shoulders. My father would often call me into his study, a sanctuary lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves overflowing with books on history, philosophy, and strategy. He'd speak to me about the great leaders of the past, men who risked everything for justice and for their kin. "Logan," he'd say, his gaze intense, "a time will come when you will be called upon to defend what is most precious. You won't do it with your fists, but with your mind and your heart." I would nod, trying to absorb the depth of his meaning, but it was the look in his eyes, stern, yes, but also filled with a powerful expectation, that ignited a fierce desire within me to become a man he would be proud of. It was the accumulation of all these profound lessons from my parents that sculpted the man I am today. When I announced my decision to enroll at the United States Military Academy, I saw a flicker of immense pride in my father's eyes. "Son," he said, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder, "you have chosen a demanding road, but I have no doubt you will walk it with honor." My mother, her face etched with a mother's natural worry, still managed a brave smile. "Take your heart with you, Logan," she pleaded softly. "Don't let that world make it hard." I pulled her into a tight embrace, assuring her I would carry her teachings with me always. I could never have conceived that only a few short years later that very promise would be challenged by a series of devastating losses and betrayals that I was completely unprepared for. The mansion, which had for so long stood as our monument to love and connection, would slowly transform into a bitter battleground. It became a place where I was forced to fight, not against a foreign enemy, but for the fractured remnants of my own family. I was 21 years old, completely consumed by the relentless punishing routine of the military academy, when a single phone call shattered my entire existence. I remember the moment with perfect clarity. I was out on the training grounds, my uniform soaked through with sweat after a brutal drill, when my commanding officer called me over, his expression grim. He told me to report to his office, immediately. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Something was wrong. "Hayes, you have an urgent call. It's your family." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm driven not by physical exertion but by a sudden, chilling dread. I took the receiver, my hands slick with sweat, and Caleb's voice, broken and strangled by sobs, came across the line. "Logan, it's Mom. Mom's gone." In that instant, the solid ground beneath me fractured and gave way. I was frozen in that small, sterile room with its cold, white walls, the very air seeming to vanish from my lungs. "What did you say?" I managed to whisper, my own voice cracking, even though I knew with sickening certainty that Caleb would never lie about something like this. "Caleb, how? How could she be?" He was weeping uncontrollably now, his words tumbling out in a shattered mess. "A car accident, a semi that lost its brakes." And just like that, Mom, the radiant, steady light of our family, had been extinguished forever. I requested emergency leave without a second thought and boarded the first available flight back to North Carolina. By the time the plane touched down, I wasn't Cadet Logan Hayes, the driven young man with a promising military career. I was just a boy who had lost his mother, adrift in a sea of confusion and pain. The mansion, once so alive with the sound of my mother's laughter, was now draped in a heavy, suffocating silence that felt utterly alien. I walked into the living room, and even the sunlight streaming through the massive windows seemed muted and gray. Caleb saw me and ran, crashing into me and wrapping his arms around my waist, his tears soaking through the fabric of my uniform. "Logan, she's really not coming back, is she?" he sobbed, his small body trembling. I had no words. All I could do was hold him as tightly as I could, fighting the urge to crumble right there with him. My father was sitting in the large armchair where he always read his morning paper. But that day the newspaper was gone. His eyes were bloodshot and hollow, and his hands were clenched around one of my mother's silk handkerchiefs, the one she always kept tucked in her pocket. He looked like a stranger, a man I didn't recognize. I desperately wanted to go to him, to wrap my arms around him, to offer some words of comfort that might lessen his agony. But I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by my own grief and helplessness. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me. And in that moment, I saw that the strong, unwavering man I'd idolized my entire life was gone. His eyes were vacant, utterly desolate, as though a vital piece of his soul had been torn away and had followed Mom into the darkness. Her funeral was held a week later on a bleak, rain-soaked afternoon. Family, friends, and a crowd of my father's business associates filled the small church near our home. I stood beside her casket, gazing at her peaceful face, a tight, painful band constricting around my heart. Caleb clung to my hand, his whole body shaking, while Dad stood off by himself in a shadowy corner, his back to the room as if trying to hide his grief from the world. A raw, primal scream built in my chest, a desperate need to rage at the injustice of it all, but I swallowed it down, knowing that no amount of anger or noise could ever bring her back. In the months that followed, the mansion became a foreign place. The sound of laughter was a distant memory, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to soak into the very walls. Dad buried himself in his work, staying late at the office and traveling constantly, as if perpetual motion was the only anesthetic for his pain. Caleb, who was only 12, retreated even further into himself. His sketchbooks lay untouched. He no longer drew the vibrant life of the forest or the endless expanse of the sky. Instead, he would just sit in his room for hours, silently clutching a wool scarf Mom had knitted for him just before she died. I did everything I could to be there for him, but the demands of the academy kept me hundreds of miles away, limiting my support to brief weekend visits and strained phone calls. "Logan, do you think Mom can see us?" he asked me once during one of those calls, his voice so small and fragile it was barely a whisper. I had to swallow the lump in my throat before I could answer, forcing my voice to sound steady and sure. "She's always with us, Caleb, right here, in our hearts." But even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow and hopelessly inadequate. Nothing could ever fill the gaping hole my mother's absence had carved into our lives. 2 years after she passed, I graduated from the academy and officially began my career in the Army. My world became a blur of long days, intense training exercises, and missions that required every ounce of my focus. But no matter how demanding my duties were, each time I returned to the mansion, the profound emptiness was there to greet me. Dad continued to work with a relentless, almost frantic energy, but he grew more and more distant with each passing month. The joyful family dinners that had once been the cornerstone of our lives were now just ghosts of a happier time. Caleb was growing up, but he was shadowed by a deep-seated sadness that I was powerless to heal. Then one evening after I'd returned home from an extended training deployment, Dad summoned me to his study. He was sitting behind his enormous desk, and I was struck by the look in his eyes, a strange and unsettling mixture of anxiety and apprehension. It was a look I had never seen on my confident, self-assured father. "Logan," he began, his voice unusually low, "there's something I need to tell you." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm getting married again." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Remarried? This man, who had always sworn that my mother was the one and only love of his life, was now planning to replace her? A storm of anger and betrayal churned in my gut, but I fought to keep my expression neutral. "Remarried?" I asked, my voice coming out colder and sharper than I'd intended. To who? Her name is Vivian, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. He explained that he'd met her through a business connection, that she was someone who understood him, someone who had brought a spark of light back into his life after years of darkness. I wanted to shout at him, to tell him that no one could ever take my mother's place, but I held my tongue. I saw something in his eyes then, not the genuine glow of a man in love, but the desperate look of someone trying to patch a hole in his own soul. Vivian arrived in our lives like an unnerving foreign wind. She was undeniably beautiful, with a cascade of polished blonde hair and a smile that seemed almost too perfect, too practiced. But there was a calculated coldness in her eyes that immediately set me on edge. She didn't come alone. She brought her daughter, Holly, who was the same age as Caleb, 14. Holly had her mother's striking features, but her personality was all sharp edges and undisguised condescension. During our first introduction, Vivian pulled me into an embrace, murmuring cloying words about how much she wanted to become a true part of our family. "Logan, I've heard so many wonderful things about you," she cooed. "I just know we're going to be so close." Her voice was as sweet as honey, but her presence felt suffocatingly artificial. I felt an immediate and visceral need to pull away. Holly, on the other hand, was openly hostile. She looked at Caleb as if he were a trespasser in his own home. "This house is massive," she commented with a dismissive smirk as we gave them a tour of the grounds. "But it must be so dull here." "Right, Caleb." I watched my brother's shoulders slump as he lowered his head, retreating into silence. It took every ounce of my self-control not to lash out at her right there on the lawn. Vivian and Holly moved into the mansion shortly after. Dad insisted on a small wedding with only a handful of his closest friends and business partners in attendance. I stood there in my dress uniform, forcing a smile for my father's sake, but my heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. Caleb, looking small and lost in his suit, gripped my hand so tightly his knuckles were white, as if he were clinging to the last piece of solid ground he knew. "Logan, is everything going to be all right?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I squeezed his hand back, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "It's going to be fine, little brother," I promised. "I've got you." But I was completely wrong. The arrival of Vivian and Holly was not a new beginning. It was the first deep, splintering crack in the foundation of our family. Vivian wasted no time in asserting her control over the mansion, systematically erasing every trace of my mother to suit her own preferences. The beloved rose bushes Mom had so lovingly tended in the garden were ripped out and replaced with flashy exotic flowers that Vivian favored. The beautiful familiar paintings Mom had so carefully chosen for the walls were taken down, swapped out for jarring pieces of modern art that felt alien and cold. I tried my best to swallow my resentment for Dad's sake, but every single alteration felt like a fresh cut, slicing away at my cherished memories of my mother. Caleb, however, bore the brunt of their cruelty. He began to tell me about Holly's relentless taunts during our phone calls. She called him a crybaby, a weirdo, an intruder. Then came the call that made my vision go red. He was sobbing, unable to get the words out at first. "Holly, she took the picture I drew for Mom," he choked out. "The one I keep on my desk. She ripped it into pieces right in front of me, Logan, and she just laughed." When he told Vivian, she'd waved it off, telling him not to be so dramatic. My blood ran hot with pure rage. That drawing, a detailed sketch of the woods behind our house that Caleb had made for Mom the Thanksgiving before she died, was one of his most prized possessions. I put in for leave that same day and was on a plane home by nightfall. That evening, I cornered Vivian and Holly in the living room. "If you ever lay a hand on my brother again or touch anything that belongs to him," I said, my voice shaking with fury, "you will answer to me. I will not let it go." Vivian plastered on that sickeningly sweet smile I had come to despise. "Logan, darling, it's all just a simple misunderstanding. We're a family now, remember?" Holly stood just behind her mother's shoulder, a smug, challenging smirk on her face. But the worst part was my father. He stood by the fireplace, a silent observer to the entire confrontation. I stared at him, my heart pleading with him to step in, to be the father who had always taught us to stand up for what was right, to defend his own son. But he just dropped his gaze to the floor, physically shrinking from the conflict. In that single silent moment, I felt something fundamental between us shatter. The unwavering loyalty I had always felt for him began to crumble. I knew then that I couldn't leave Caleb in that house. The atmosphere was toxic, and he was too gentle, too sensitive to withstand Vivian and Holly's constant, casual cruelty. I had to find a way out for him. I had to get him away from the poisoned mansion that had once been our sanctuary. Ultimately, I found a highly regarded boarding school up in New Hampshire, a place where he could get a top-tier education and, more importantly, live in a secure and supportive environment. I drained my personal savings to pay for the first year's tuition, knowing it would mean living on a razor-thin budget for the foreseeable future. It didn't matter. The day I drove Caleb to the school, he stood at the iron gates of the mansion, clutching a backpack stuffed with the few mementos of our mother he had left. "Logan, I don't want to leave," he said, his eyes swollen and red. "But I can't stand being here with them anymore." I knelt down in front of him, meeting his gaze. "Listen to me, little brother. This isn't leaving home. Home isn't a building. Home is you and me. And I will always, always be there for you no matter what. You call me anytime you need me." Dad was standing at the gate watching the scene unfold. "Logan, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice thick with a pain I couldn't quite decipher. "This is Caleb's home. This is our home." I turned to face him, a heavy sadness settling in my chest. "No, Dad," I said quietly. "It's not our home anymore." I took Caleb's hand, led him to the car, and drove away without a single glance in the rearview mirror. The mansion, once the shining symbol of our family's unbreakable love, now felt like nothing more than a pile of cold ash. I knew deep down that I had done the only thing I could to protect my brother, but that certainty did little to dull the ache in my own heart. My father, the man I had once revered above all others, now felt like a stranger on a distant shore. And I, Logan Hayes, found myself standing at a bitter crossroads, torn between a lifetime of loyalty and a fresh, gaping wound, wondering if the pieces of our shattered family could ever be put back together again. In the years that followed Caleb's departure for boarding school, I poured every ounce of my being into my work. The Army became my refuge, the one place where I felt a sense of order and stability. It was there that my father's old lessons about discipline and duty still resonated, guiding every decision I made. I rose through the ranks quickly, earning multiple commendations and medals for my service. Yet with every medal pinned to my chest, with every word of praise from a superior officer, my first thought was always of my father. I could still see the undisguised pride in his eyes on the day I graduated from the academy. I can't count the number of times I wanted to call him, to share some piece of good news, but I would pick up the phone and my hand would just hover over the keypad. The physical distance between us wasn't vast, but the emotional chasm that had opened up felt wider and deeper than any ocean. Caleb, now a young man of 18, would call me from time to time from school. His voice was stronger, more confident than it used to be, but I could still detect the persistent undercurrent of sadness in his tone. "Logan, I miss home," he confessed late one night. "Not the house, I mean our real family, the way we used to be." I had to take a moment to compose myself, to keep my own voice from breaking. "Me too, little brother," I said. "Me too. But don't you worry about a thing. I'm always here for you." I made several attempts to bridge the gap with my father, but every phone call was painfully brief and stilted. Vivian was a constant presence, a gatekeeper who would inevitably insert herself into our conversations with that cloyingly sweet yet subtly sharp voice of hers. "Logan, your father is just so terribly busy," she'd purr, "but you should know he's just bursting with pride for you." I could feel her influence like a tangible thing, a suffocating barrier being constructed brick by brick between my father and me. Then, on a dark, storm-lashed afternoon when I was 31 years old, by then a lieutenant colonel with a crushing workload, Caleb called me. His voice was laced with a panic I hadn't heard in years. "Logan, it's Dad. He's sick. He's really, really sick." A cold fist clenched in my gut. "What's wrong with him? Who told you this?" I demanded, my mind racing. Caleb explained that an old family friend, a Mr. Peterson, had reached out to him directly. My father, Richard Hayes, the man I had always seen as an unshakable mountain, was confined to his bed. He had a terminal illness, liver cancer, in its final aggressive stage. Despite my impossibly tight schedule, I requested immediate leave. As the plane descended into North Carolina, my rank and my uniform melted away. I was no longer Lieutenant Colonel Logan Hayes. I was just a son, consumed by a desperate need to see his father, to finally try and repair the fractures I had allowed to fester for far too long. But when I pulled up to the mansion, the massive iron gates were shut and locked. And the person who came out to meet me was, of course, Vivian. She stood at the entrance, dressed in an impeccably tailored, expensive silk dress, that same artificial smile stretched across her face. Flanking her were two imposing security guards, their broad shoulders and stony expressions making them look more like statues than men. "Logan, you've come," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "Your father, he's terribly weak. He isn't seeing anyone right now." I took a slow, deep breath, fighting to control the hot surge of anger that rose in my throat. "I'm not just anyone," I said, my voice low and tight. "I'm his son. I'm going to see my father." Vivian just shook her head, her tone dripping with false sympathy, yet underscored with absolute authority. "The doctor has been very clear. He needs complete rest. Please try to understand." A primal urge to shove past her, to sprint up the driveway to my father's room seized me, but I knew that any aggressive move would only play into her hands. So I stood there, helpless under a sky that was bleeding into a fiery red sunset, feeling my own blood boil. The guards watched me, their eyes cold and empty, their arms crossed over their chests, a clear and silent warning not to test them. I balled my hands into fists, my fingernails digging so hard into my palms that I felt a sharp, stinging pain. But I refused to let her win this. I would not let her sever this last tenuous thread connecting me to my father. Not now. Not ever. Taking another ragged breath, I forced my voice to remain level, even though every word felt like it was being ripped from my core. "Vivian," I said, locking my eyes on hers, "you have absolutely no right to keep me from him. My father is in that house, and I am going to see him with or without your permission." She tilted her head, that infuriating smile never wavering, but for a split second I saw a flash of something cold and hard in her eyes. "Logan, you're being far too emotional. Why don't you go back to your hotel? I'll give you a call when your father is feeling a bit stronger." Her words were a deliberate, calculated insult, delivered with that same sugary sweetness, as if she were speaking to a bothersome neighbor and not the son of the dying man who lay just beyond the gate. I took a step back, not because I was intimidated, but because I needed to think. My training kicked in. I was no longer an impulsive kid. I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, conditioned to maintain composure in the most volatile of circumstances. But this wasn't a war zone. This was my family, my home, and that made everything a million times more complicated. I looked at Vivian's triumphant face, then at the imposing iron gate behind her. The entrance to the home that had once been my whole world, now a fortress designed to keep me out. "You are going to regret this," I said, my voice low and steady with conviction. Then I turned, walked back to my rental car, and got in. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged bursts. I couldn't let her do this. I couldn't let her isolate him. My father was in there, sick and vulnerable, and he might be needing me now more than he ever had in his life. I pictured his face, the pride shining in his eyes at my graduation. I heard his voice in my head, repeating the words he'd drilled into me my whole life. A man stands up for what matters. And at that moment, nothing in the world mattered more than my father. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the local police department. A calm, professional female voice answered on the second ring. "Durham County Police Department, how may I help you?" I took a deep, steadying breath, fighting to keep the tremor out of my voice. "My name is Logan Hayes. I'm outside my family's home at 1427 Willow Creek Road in North Carolina. My father is inside and he's terminally ill. The woman currently living in the house, his wife, is refusing to let me see him. I am his son and I need to get inside." The dispatcher on the other end asked a series of standard questions and I answered each one, keeping my replies as brief and clear as possible. "We'll dispatch a unit to your location immediately, sir," she said. I thanked her and ended the call, a small measure of the immense pressure on my chest releasing, but the knot of tension in my gut remained. I sat in the car, my eyes locked on that gate, and waited. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 15 minutes before a patrol car pulled up behind me, its blue and red lights painting the twilight with strobing colors. Two officers emerged, an older, serious-looking man and a younger woman holding a small notepad. I got out of my car, introduced myself, and quickly summarized the situation. The male officer listened, his gaze shifting from me to the imposing gate. "We'll handle it from here, sir," he said. "Just stay calm." They walked up to the call box and pressed the button. After a moment, Vivian's voice came through the speaker, and a few seconds later she appeared at the gate, still wearing that silk dress, her smile now stretched into a mask of pure artifice. "Oh, officers, good evening," she chirped, her voice oozing saccharine sweetness. "Is there some sort of problem?" I stood a few feet behind them, feeling the anger I'd been trying to suppress begin to simmer again. "Ma'am, we received a report that you're preventing Mr. Hayes from seeing his father," the female officer stated, her tone polite but firm. "He is the homeowner's son, and as such he has a legal right to enter the premises." Vivian blinked, her face a perfect picture of innocent confusion. "Oh my heavens, no, this is all just a terrible misunderstanding," she exclaimed, turning her wide eyes to me. "Logan, darling, I wasn't trying to stop you. I was only thinking of your father's health. He's just so fragile right now." Her performance was flawless, but I wasn't buying it for a second. She then turned that smile on me, her eyes as cold as ice chips. "If you want to come inside, Logan, then of course you can. I was only ever thinking about what's best for your father." I clenched my jaw, recognizing the performance for what it was. But I didn't engage. I just nodded to the officers. "I'm going in now." With a dramatic sigh, Vivian unlocked the gate and led us up the long driveway. The two guards stepped aside but followed our progress with their eyes, their expressions making it clear they still viewed me as a potential threat. Once inside the mansion, I was struck by how much had changed. The grand scale was the same, but it felt like a stranger's house. All of my mother's favorite paintings were gone, replaced with pieces I didn't recognize. The faint, sweet smell of roses that used to drift in from the garden was gone too, choked out by the cloying scent of Vivian's expensive perfume. She led me and the officers up the main staircase to the master bedroom where my father lay. The officers remained in the hallway as I stepped across the threshold, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Dad was propped up in the large bed, looking so fragile and diminished that for a terrifying second I didn't recognize him. His skin had a waxy pale quality, his eyes were clouded with pain, and a network of medical tubes snaked around his frail body like ivy. I sank to my knees beside the bed and took his hand. It felt impossibly thin and cool in mine. "Dad," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "It's me. It's Logan." He slowly opened his eyes and focused on my face. A weak, trembling smile touched his lips. "Logan. My boy," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "I'm so sorry for everything." 1,000 questions burned in my mind. I wanted to ask him why he'd let Vivian push us away, why he'd allowed our family to be torn apart. But looking at him then, all I could do was hold his hand tighter as hot tears streamed down my cheeks. "I'm here now, Dad," I managed to say. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Vivian stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching us. I could feel her cold, possessive gaze on me like a physical weight. I could feel her watching us, a silent, menacing presence in the doorway. After a few moments, the officers, satisfied that I had been granted access, nodded to Vivian. "Looks like everything's under control here," the male officer said. "Give us a call if there's anything else." They turned and left, and as the sound of their patrol car faded into the distance, Vivian's smile evaporated. She clapped her hands sharply, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet hallway, and the 2 security guards materialized in the doorway, their movements swift and silent. "Logan, you've had your visit," she said, her voice now stripped of all its former sweetness, leaving only cold, hard steel. "It's time for you to leave." I rose to my feet and faced her, my entire body humming with a mixture of grief and rage. "You can't just throw me out," I said, my voice dangerously low. "This is my father's house." But before I could say another word, the guards were on me, each grabbing one of my arms in a powerful vice-like grip. They began to pull me from the room. I instinctively resisted, but they were immensely strong, and I knew that a full-blown fight would only terrify my father. "Vivian, you will pay for this," I yelled as they manhandled me down the grand staircase. She followed us, her footsteps impossibly light on the marble floor. "Logan, don't make a scene," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your father needs his rest. You're upsetting him." They shoved me out the front door and down the driveway. I heard the heavy iron gate slam shut behind me, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the night. I stood there alone under the darkening sky, my breath coming in ragged, angry gasps. I had seen him, but it had only been for a few precious minutes, and Vivian had made it brutally clear that it would be the last time. My first instinct was to call the police again, but I knew it would be useless. Vivian was too clever, too adept at twisting the situation to her advantage. They would see it as a domestic dispute, nothing more. But I wasn't going to give up. I couldn't. My father was still in that house, trapped and alone, and I knew in my gut that he needed me. He needed Caleb. He needed to know that his sons were there for him, even if it was just to hold his hand one last time. I had to find another way. I drove back to the base, but my focus was shattered. I couldn't concentrate on my duties, on mission briefings, on the orders I was supposed to be giving. My mind was consumed with a single obsessive thought: how to tear down the wall Vivian had so carefully constructed around my father. The days that followed were a blur of increasingly desperate attempts to make contact. I called my father's private line every single day, sometimes 3 or 4 times, but he never once picked up. The phone would ring endlessly until it finally clicked over to voicemail, and I would be forced to listen to Vivian's sickly, sweet recorded greeting. "You've reached the Hayes residence," Please leave a message after the tone." I left message after message, my voice shifting from pleading to demanding and back again. "Vivian, this is Logan. Please, I'm begging you, just let me speak to my father. He's my father." But my pleas were met with a wall of silence. I tried sending text messages, keeping them short and direct. "Dad, it's Logan. I just want to know how you are. Please call me back." But my phone screen remained blank, my words swallowed by an indifferent digital void. I didn't stop there. I began writing letters, long ones penned by hand, the way my mother used to when she had something important to communicate. In those letters, I told him everything. I wrote about my life in the Army, about Caleb and how well he was doing in school, about how much I missed our old family dinners. I poured my heart out on the page, telling him how deeply I regretted letting the distance between us grow so vast, and that all I wanted was to see him, just one more time. I sent the letters to the mansion, praying that one of them might somehow find its way into his hands. But weeks turned into a month, and still there was no reply. I was shouting into a void. I started to suspect that my father never even saw those letters, that Vivian was likely intercepting them just as she had blocked every other attempt I'd made to reach him. I called Caleb, who was now in his final year of university, and he confirmed my fears. "Logan, I've been calling Dad every day too," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "But Vivian always answers. She gives me the same excuses every time. He's resting, he's in the middle of a treatment." "I don't believe her, Logan. I think she's hiding something." The raw pain in my brother's voice was like a physical blow. I wanted so badly to reassure him, to tell him that everything was going to be fine, but I couldn't bring myself to lie to him. "I'm going to find a way, Caleb," I promised, my voice more confident than I felt. "I swear to you, I will figure this out." I reached out to my father's oldest friends, men like Mr. Peterson, but they all told me the same story. Vivian had shut them out completely. "She's not letting anyone near him, Logan," Peterson told me over the phone, a note of helpless defeat in his voice. "I've tried to visit Richard twice now, and both times she told me he wasn't up for company. I don't know what else to do." A fresh wave of anger washed over me, but underneath it was a growing, terrifying sense of powerlessness. Here I was, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, a man trained to command and overcome obstacles, and yet, against this one woman, I was utterly failing to protect my own father in his time of greatest need. About a month after my last visit, I was on base preparing for a morning briefing when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw the number for the mansion displayed on the screen. For a split second, my heart leaped with a desperate hope that it was Dad. But when I answered, it was Vivian's voice that greeted me, as cool and composed as ever. "Logan," she said without any preamble, "I'm calling to inform you that your father, Richard, passed away peacefully this morning." The world stopped. I stood frozen in the hallway, the phone pressed to my ear as if the ground had just opened up and swallowed me whole. "No," I whispered into the phone. "No, that's not possible." But Vivian continued, her tone as detached and formal as if she were reading a corporate press release. "He passed in his sleep. I did everything I could to make him comfortable. The funeral will be held this Saturday. You and Caleb are welcome to attend." I have no memory of what I said after that, or if I said anything at all. I just remember a vast, hollow emptiness opening up inside me, as if a fundamental part of my being had been violently ripped away. My father, the man who had built my moral compass, who had taught me the meaning of integrity, was gone. And I hadn't been there. I hadn't been able to say goodbye. The first thing I did was call Caleb. My voice broke as I delivered the news, and his devastated sobs on the other end of the line were like daggers in my heart. "Logan, why?" he cried. "Why wouldn't she let us see him?" I had no answers for him. I drove to his university, picked him up from his dorm, and we flew to North Carolina together to prepare for the funeral. Walking into the small church near the mansion, the very same church where we had buried our mother, felt like stepping back into a recurring nightmare. The pews were filled with people, my father's old friends, his business associates, and dozens of faces I didn't recognize, all gathered to pay their last respects. Vivian and Holly were positioned at the front of the church, perfectly cast in their roles as the grieving widow and stepdaughter. Vivian was dressed in a stunningly elegant black dress, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes were as hard and cold as ever. It was a masterful performance. Holly stood beside her, her head dutifully bowed, but I saw her shoot a quick glance in my direction, a flicker of a triumphant smirk playing on her lips before it was gone. Caleb and I stood off to the side near the back of the church, his hand gripping mine. I stared at the polished wood of the coffin at the front of the sanctuary, and a wave of regret so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. I hadn't done enough. I hadn't been strong enough or smart enough to break through Vivian's defenses. I had failed him. I hadn't been there for him when he needed me most. Caleb squeezed my hand, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Logan, do you think Dad will forgive us?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I pulled him into a fierce hug. "Dad loved us more than anything, Caleb," I murmured into his hair. "Nothing will ever change that." After the service, Caleb and I drove to the mansion. We weren't expecting a warm welcome. We just wanted to gather a few of our father's personal effects. His favorite watch, maybe, or the old leather-bound journal where he used to write down his thoughts about our mother. We just needed something to hold on to, some tangible piece of him to keep close, to feel like he was still a part of our lives. But when we arrived, the iron gate was locked tight, and standing just on the other side were Vivian and Holly, positioned like sentinels guarding a fortress. "Logan, Caleb," Vivian said, her voice a sickeningly sweet purr. "I know this is a difficult day, but I'm afraid you can't come in." I stared at her, dumbfounded, the words hitting me like a physical slap. "What are you talking about?" I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "This is our father's house. We just want to get a few of his things." Vivian shook her head, that practiced, sympathetic smile returning to her lips. "I'm afraid this house now belongs to me and my daughter," she said calmly. "Richard updated his will shortly before he passed. He left all of his assets, including this estate, to me and Holly." She then slid a folded document through the bars of the gate. "If you wish to contest it, you can speak with my attorney." I took the paper and unfolded it. It was a legal document, and at the bottom was a shaky, unfamiliar version of my father's signature, declaring that the $70 million mansion and everything it contained now belonged to Vivian and her daughter. Caleb gripped my arm, his body trembling. "Logan, Dad would never do this," he whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief and hurt. "He loved us. He wouldn't just give everything away." I looked at my brother's shattered face and my own heart cracked right down the middle. A white-hot rage surged through me. I wanted to tear the gate from its hinges, to storm the house, to scream until my lungs gave out that this was our home, our parents' legacy built on love and sacrifice. But the look in Vivian's eyes, cold, calculating, and utterly confident, told me that she believed she had already won. "Vivian," I said, my voice shaking with suppressed fury, "you can have this house, you can have the money, but you will never, ever touch the legacy our parents left us. I will find out the truth." She just smiled, a silent, smug acknowledgement of my threat, and then gestured subtly to the two guards standing behind her. They took a step forward, a clear, unspoken warning. I grabbed Caleb's arm and pulled him back toward our car. "Come on, little brother," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Let's go. We'll figure this out." As I drove away from the mansion, a fire ignited in the pit of my stomach. It was a cold, hard flame of pure determination, Vivian and Holly could celebrate their victory for now, but they had underestimated me. I am Logan Hayes, the son of Richard and Eleanor Hayes, and I was raised to fight for what is right, no matter the odds. That mansion was never just about money or property. It was a symbol of everything my parents stood for, everything they had built. And I would not let a pair of greedy, manipulative thieves steal it away. I glanced over at Caleb, saw the grief in his eyes warring with a newfound resolve, and I knew without a single doubt that we would face this fight together. We would get justice for our father, whatever it took. I took Caleb back to my small apartment near the base, the place I stayed when I was off duty. He sank onto the sofa, clutching the old backpack filled with our mother's keepsakes, his eyes staring blankly at the wall. "Logan, do you really think Dad signed that will?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I knelt in front of him and put my hands on his shoulders, forcing him to look at me. "No, Caleb," I said firmly. "I don't believe it for a second. Dad loved us. He would never have done that to us. Not in a million years. I'm going to find out what really happened." My first move was to contact Mr. Peterson, my father's oldest and closest friend, the one person who had tried to sound the alarm about Vivian. I called him and he agreed to meet me at a quiet coffee shop in the center of town. When I got there, he was already waiting at a table in the back, his weathered face creased with worry. "Logan, I tried to warn you," he said as I sat down, his voice low and grave. "Once Richard fell ill, Vivian took complete control. She isolated him from everyone. I never trusted her, not for a moment, but I couldn't find any concrete proof of wrongdoing. I told him about the will Vivian had shown us at the gate, about her claim that she and Holly now owned the mansion and everything in it." Peterson shook his head, a flash of righteous anger in his eyes. "Richard would never have done that," he said fiercely. "You know how much he adored you boys. That house was meant to be your family's legacy, not a prize for that woman." He paused for a moment, leaning in closer. "There is someone you need to talk to," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Your father's longtime attorney, a man named Arthur Vance. He handled all of Richard's estate planning for decades. If there's a true will, he's the one who will know about it." I found Arthur Vance's law firm in an old, distinguished-looking brick building in downtown Durham. He was a seasoned lawyer who had been on my father's payroll since I was a boy. His office was a sanctuary of dark wood, filled with towering shelves packed with legal files and the comforting dusty scent of old paper. Vance, a man well into his 60s with a full head of silver hair, welcomed me with a warm but somber expression. "Logan, my boy, I am so deeply sorry for your loss," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "I wanted to contact you myself, but that woman, Vivian, she made things exceptionally difficult." I laid out the whole story for him. The will Vivian had produced, her locking us out of the mansion, her audacious claim that she and Holly were the sole inheritors. He listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. Vance listened to my story without interruption, nodding slowly. But I saw his hand tighten around the pen he was holding until his knuckles were white. "Logan," he said when I had finished, his voice heavy with conviction, "I was your father's attorney for more than 30 years. I knew Richard Hayes as well as I know my own brother. He would never, under any circumstances, have left everything to Vivian without providing for you and Caleb. It's unthinkable." He stood up, walked over to a large, locked filing cabinet, and retrieved a thick manila folder. "This," he said, placing it on the desk in front of me, "is what you need to see." He opened it carefully. Before his illness became severe, Richard came to me and we set up a secret, irrevocable trust. He was adamant that the mansion and the majority of his assets were to be passed down to you and Caleb. The will Vivian showed you, I have serious doubts about its validity. My heart hammered against my ribs. You're saying the will she has could be a forgery? Vance nodded grimly. It's a strong possibility. That or it was signed under extreme duress at a time when Richard was no longer of sound mind. Vivian was present for every single one of his final meetings with his new legal team, and I was explicitly excluded from all of them. In my experience, that is a massive red flag. A flicker of hope ignited inside me, but it was quickly followed by a hot surge of rage. If Vance was right, then Vivian hadn't just isolated my father. She had actively manipulated and taken advantage of him during the most vulnerable moments of his life. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to remain composed. How can we prove it? I asked. Vance let out a long, weary sigh. It won't be simple, Logan. We will need hard evidence. The original trust documents, which I have here, are a start, but we'll need more. Recordings, emails, any correspondence that shows Richard's true intentions. Vivian is cunning, but she's not infallible. I will begin the legal proceedings on my end, but you'll need to do some digging as well. Speak to anyone and everyone who was around your father in his final months. I left Vance's office with my head spinning, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. We were going to fight. I knew this battle would be an uphill climb, but my military training had prepared me for this kind of fight. I knew how to strategize, how to exercise patience, and most importantly, how to persevere against overwhelming odds. Now I would use those skills to defend my family and honor my parents' memory. I called Caleb immediately and told him everything about the secret trust, about Vance's suspicions regarding the will. Logan, if Dad set that up for us, then Vivian has to be lying, he said, a new energy in his voice. We have to do something. We have to fight her. A small smile touched my lips as I listened to the determination in his voice. We will, little brother, I said. We'll do it together. And so my investigation began. My first step was to reach out to the people who had worked for my father for years, his personal secretary, his driver, and the mansion's former head housekeeper, a wonderful woman named Maria who had quit her job not long after Vivian moved in. Maria agreed to meet me at a small park near her new apartment. The moment she saw me, she pulled me into a tight hug, her eyes welling with tears. Logan, I am so sorry about your father, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He was such a good man. I wanted to call you sooner, but that woman, Vivian... Maria confirmed my worst fears. She told me that during my father's final months, Vivian had seized total control of the household. She systematically fired most of the long-serving staff, replacing them with people who were loyal only to her. I overheard her on the phone one afternoon, Maria whispered, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder, as if she expected Vivian to materialize out of thin air. She was talking to a new lawyer, not Mr. Vance. She said something about getting the final paperwork handled quickly. I didn't understand it at the time, but now... I think she was plotting something, Logan, I really do. Maria's testimony was another crucial piece of the puzzle I was painstakingly trying to assemble. I thanked her profusely, promised to keep her updated, and continued my search for the truth. Every new piece of information fueled my resolve. I then tried to contact the doctors who had treated my father, but I was met with a wall of resistance. They all cited patient confidentiality and refused to speak with me. I did, however, manage to track down a former palliative care nurse who had looked after him during his last stay in the hospital. She agreed to speak with me anonymously over the phone. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, she said, her voice hushed. I could lose my job for telling you this, but something never sat right with me. That woman, Vivian, she was always there, especially when your father had to sign documents. There was one time in particular, he looked so confused, so weak. I honestly don't think he even knew what he was signing. The puzzle pieces were slowly clicking into place, but I knew I still lacked the smoking gun, the irrefutable evidence we would need in court. I worked day and night with Arthur Vance, who began a deep dive into my father's financial records. It didn't take him long to uncover a series of highly suspicious transactions. Several of my father's largest investment accounts had been transferred directly into Vivian's name in the weeks leading up to his death. "This is highly irregular," Vance told me, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Richard was always so meticulous with his finances. This pattern strongly suggests coercion, but without the original trust documents to counter it, it's still circumstantial." Meanwhile, Vivian and Holly were not content to simply sit back and enjoy their ill-gotten gains. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived at my apartment from Vivian's attorney, a slick operator named Daniel Reed. The letter was a formal cease and desist, warning Caleb and me to stop harassing his clients and threatening a defamation lawsuit if we continued to question the legitimacy of the will. I ripped the letter to shreds and tossed it in the garbage, but the message was clear. Vivian was trying to intimidate us into silence. She had the money, the connections, and the ruthlessness to make our lives very difficult. But I was not about to be bullied into submission. Caleb and I decided it was time for a direct confrontation. We drove back to the mansion, not to plead or beg, but to demand to see the original copy of the will she claimed my father had signed. When we arrived, it was Holly who answered the gate, her arms crossed, a look of pure defiance on her face. "What do you two want now?" she sneered. "My mother already told you this house belongs to us." "We're here to see the will," I said, my voice steady and firm. "The original document, not a photocopy." Holly let out a derisive snort and turned to shout for her mother. A moment later, Vivian appeared in the doorway, that infuriatingly placid smile plastered on her face. "Logan, Caleb, you boys certainly are persistent," she said with a condescending sigh. "As I've already told you, the will has been legally filed and recognized by the probate court. You don't have a leg to stand on." I took a step closer to the gate, locking my eyes with hers. "Vivian, you and I both know the truth. My father would never have cut his sons out of his life. If you're so certain that your claim is legitimate, then show us the original document. Unless, of course, you have something to hide." For the briefest of moments, I saw her smile flicker. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tiny crack in her carefully constructed facade. And it was enough. I knew I was on the right path. She quickly recovered her composure, her expression hardening. "You want to play games, Logan? Fine. From now on, you can direct all of your questions to my attorney." With that, she spun around and stalked back into the house, the heavy front door slamming shut behind her, leaving Caleb and me standing alone at the gate once again. But this time, I wasn't discouraged. I was energized. I knew she was hiding something, and I was more determined than ever to find out what it was. The legal battle had officially begun. Mr. Vance filed a motion with the court, formally challenging the validity of the will Vivian had produced. He also submitted evidence of the secret trust my father had established with him years earlier, explaining that the original signed documents had mysteriously vanished. Predictably, Vivian and Holly, represented by their high-priced lawyer Daniel Reed, fought back with everything they had. They hired their own team of so-called experts to testify that my father had willingly and knowingly created the new will, and that the trust Vance spoke of was nothing more than an unfinalized draft that had been superseded. The court proceedings were emotionally and mentally exhausting. Vivian would show up to each hearing in a new, ridiculously expensive designer outfit, playing the part of the distraught, grieving widow to perfection, while Holly sat beside her, dabbing at her dry eyes with a handkerchief. Caleb and I, with Vance's unwavering support, stood our ground, but every session was a brutal, draining ordeal. There were moments when I felt like I was wrestling with a hydra. For every lie we disproved, two more seemed to sprout in its place. Then finally we got the break we had been praying for. One morning, Vance called me and told me to come to his office immediately. The excitement in his voice was palpable. "Logan, we've got it," he said the moment I walked through the door. He handed me a small, unmarked USB flash drive. "An anonymous source from inside your father's company sent this to me. It's a complete digitally signed backup of the original trust document. It was hidden deep in their internal server archives." He plugged the drive into his computer and pulled up the file. And there it was, in black and white. The mansion and the vast majority of my father's estate were to be left to Caleb and me, with a smaller but still substantial portion set aside for Vivian to ensure she would be well cared for. My father's unmistakable digital signature, along with the date and timestamp, was the undeniable proof we needed. "This is it," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "He never abandoned us. He never would have." The final hearing was held 1 month later. Armed with the authenticated trust document, Vance systematically dismantled Vivian's case. Her lawyer, Reed, tried to object, to cast doubt on the document's authenticity, but his arguments fell apart under the weight of the digital evidence. The judge didn't take long to reach a decision. He ruled that the will Vivian had presented was null and void, and that the irrevocable trust represented my father's true and final wishes. The mansion and the bulk of the estate was to be returned to Caleb and me. When the verdict was read, Vivian and Holly just sat there, their faces ashen, their masks of grief finally shattered. I looked at Vivian not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound and aching sadness. "You lost, Vivian," I said quietly as we filed out of the courtroom. "You can keep the money my father left you. But the one thing I will never forgive you for is that you robbed me of the chance to say goodbye." Vivian said nothing. She just stood up, grabbed Holly by the arm, and stalked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. Caleb and I remained where we were, our hands clasped together, a profound sense of relief washing over us. Justice at long last had been served. The mansion, the enduring symbol of our family's love and our parents' legacy, was finally back where it belonged. A few days after the trial, Caleb and I returned to the house. As we walked through the now open iron gate, it felt like I was returning home after a long and arduous war. We strolled through the garden, past the empty flower beds where our mother's roses had once bloomed, and into the living room, where the echoes of our parents' voices still seemed to linger in the air. In my father's study, I found his favorite wristwatch, right where he'd always kept it in his top desk drawer. Caleb found the old leather journal, its pages filled with my father's elegant, sloping handwriting, full of memories and anecdotes about our mother. "Logan," Caleb said, his voice choked with emotion, "we did it. Mom and Dad, they would be so proud of us." I pulled him into a hug, hot tears finally streaming down my face. "Yes, little brother," I said, "we did. We protected their legacy." In the end, Caleb and I decided that we couldn't live in the mansion. It was too big for just the two of us and too full of both happy and painful memories. Instead, we worked with a local foundation to transform it into a community arts and learning center, a place that would host charitable events and offer classes in art and literature to underprivileged children. All the things our mother had been so passionate about. It was our way of honoring our parents, of ensuring that their legacy of love and generosity would continue to touch lives for years to come. This long, painful journey taught me that family is about so much more than shared blood. It's about love. It's about loyalty. And sometimes it's about fighting with everything you have for what you know is right. I, Logan Hayes, finally learned how to reconcile the disciplined strength of a soldier with the deep well of compassion my mother had instilled in me. And I learned that while a person like Vivian can try to steal your inheritance, They can never, ever take away the values your parents planted in your heart. Standing on the lawn of the estate, in the very spot where my mother's roses once flourished, a quiet sense of stillness settled over me, a feeling I had thought was gone for good. The same morning sun I remembered from my childhood streamed through the tall pines, casting familiar shimmering patterns on the grass. The house, with its pale stone walls and soaring windows, was no longer a grim battlefield of pain and betrayal. It had been reclaimed, transformed back into a monument to our family's love, a testament to the legacy my parents had built not with money but with their hearts. Caleb stood beside me holding our father's old journal. I could see the worn, yellowed pages filled with the story of his love for our mother, written during his darkest, loneliest days after she was gone. "Logan," he said, his voice no longer the fragile whisper of a boy, but the steady, deep tone of a man. "We did it. We kept our promise to Mom and Dad." I turned and looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the light of hope shining in his eyes. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the quiet strength of someone who had faced the worst and endured. I smiled and put my hand on his shoulder. "Yes, little brother," I said. "We did." The choice to turn the mansion into a community center was not one we made lightly. It was more than a building. It was the entire landscape of our childhood, the repository of every memory of evenings by the fire, of boisterous family dinners, of the life-shaping lessons our parents gave us. But we both knew, without having to say it, that to keep it locked away for ourselves would be a betrayal of everything they stood for. Our mother, with her boundless, selfless heart, would have wanted its warmth and beauty shared. Our father, a man of profound integrity, always believed that a person's true legacy is what they contribute to the world. And so we set the plan in motion. We would transform the estate into a haven for underprivileged children, a place where they could learn about art and literature and gain the skills they needed to build their own bright futures. It was the only fitting tribute, a way to keep the spirit of our parents alive, not as a memory locked behind stone walls, but as a living, breathing force for good in the world. We named the community center Hayes House, a simple and direct tribute to our parents. Caleb, channeling his artistic soul, took on the task of designing a massive mural for the main hall. He chose to bring a vibrant forest to life on the wall, a loving recreation of a small painting our mother had once made for him. I would often stand and watch him work, his brush moving with a quiet confidence across the vast canvas. And in those moments, I could almost feel our mother's presence, a warm and proud smile for her youngest son. I found my own way to contribute, adapting the leadership and strategic skills from my military career to create mentorship programs for local teenagers. Every time I witnessed a child's face light up as they finished their first painting, or saw a teenager's confidence grow as they completed one of my courses, I felt the living pulse of my parents' legacy. One sunny afternoon, not long after the center officially opened, Caleb and I stood together on the second-floor balcony. We looked down at the gardens, now filled with the joyous shouts and laughter of children playing on the lawn, the sounds echoing in a way that reminded me so much of our own childhood. "Logan," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think Mom and Dad would have really loved this." I nodded, a wave of gratitude and sorrow washing over me as tears welled in my eyes. "They would have, Caleb," I managed to say. "They would be so proud." But our journey didn't end with winning back the mansion. It was also a profound journey of healing, not just for Caleb and me, but for our memory of our father. For so long I had carried a deep and bitter anger toward him. Anger that he had allowed Vivian to poison our family, that he hadn't been strong enough to protect us. But finding the trust, and later, reading through the journal filled with his desperate, loving words for us, I finally began to understand. My father hadn't abandoned us. He had been a man ensnared, trapped by his own overwhelming grief, by his loneliness, and by the cruel and calculated manipulations of a woman who preyed on his weakness. And in that understanding, I finally found the grace to forgive him, just as my mother had always taught me to do. A truly strong man understands how to open his heart and forgive. Her words came back to me as clear as if she were standing right beside me. Caleb and I found our way back to each other as well. The years of separation, me lost in the rigid world of the military, him isolated at boarding school, had created a quiet chasm between us. But the shared fight for our family's honor forged a new and unbreakable bond. We were no longer just brothers. We were partners, a team that had faced down adversity and emerged victorious together. One evening, as we were sitting in the quiet of the center's main living room, I looked over at him and said, "Little brother, you have no idea how proud I am of you." He looked back at me and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, the first I'd seen on his face in years. "I'm proud of you too, Logan," he said. As for Vivian and Holly, they disappeared from our lives the day the trial ended. I heard through the grapevine that they had sold their assets and moved to another state, living off the inheritance my father had, in his kindness, still left for Vivian in the trust. A small, petty part of me wanted to feel a sense of vindication, of victory over them, but I found that I couldn't. My mother's lessons ran too deep. Compassion, she always said, is a sign of strength, not weakness. I could never forgive what they did, but I made a conscious choice not to let bitterness and hatred take root in my heart. The empty, hollow lives they had built for themselves on a foundation of lies and greed would be their own punishment. I had finally found the balance I had been searching for my whole life. The army taught me to be hard, to be unyielding, to face down any enemy without hesitation. But this journey taught me that the most dangerous enemies are not the ones you face on a battlefield. They are the insidious forces of doubt, despair, and the deep fractures that can form in your own heart. I realized that my fight had never really been about reclaiming a house. It was about preserving the sacred values my parents had given me: love, loyalty, and responsibility. My story, of course, isn't over. Life will always present new battles, new challenges. But I face the future without fear. I have Caleb by my side, our parents' lessons as my unwavering compass, and Hayes' house standing as a living reminder that family, even when fractured by loss, is the most powerful and precious thing in this world. For I have learned that love and loyalty are forces strong enough to overcome any trial. The greatest inheritance is not one of stocks or property, but of the principles and character that are passed down heart to heart, from one generation to the next. And I, Logan Hayes, will continue to live by that code, to fight for what is right and to love with all my strength, just as my parents showed me.